Hello and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars, and practitioners from across disciplines and professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing a special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Professor Jarvis Givens. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any point throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jarvis Givens, the Susan Young Murray Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute and Assistant Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In concert with Radcliffe's mission, Professor Givens is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research centers around the intersection of the history of American education, 19th and 20th century African American history, and the critical theories of race and schooling. Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. He was a Dean's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 2016-2018, a Ford Dissertation and Pre-Doctoral Fellow, and a Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellow. Recently, he received a $610,000 grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to co-create the Black Teachers Archives, a digital source to preserve the more than 100-year history of colored teacher associations. Givens' historical scholarship informs contemporary educational research, specifically studying the experience of Black teachers and students in urban settings. Givens has published in journals including Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Source, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, and the Harvard Educational Review. At Radcliffe, Jarvis completed his first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Arts of Black Teaching, which explored the subversive history of Black education, focusing particularly on the concealed pedagogical practices of African American teachers. Givens uses his Carter G. Woodson's life and work to illuminate how Black teachers challenged the hostile educational curricula, policies, and the political forces that undermined their work. In doing so, they developed what Givens calls a tradition of fugitive pedagogy, a theory of practice of Black education in America, which remains essential for teachers and students today. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Jarvis Givens.
All right. Thank you, Claudia, for that introduction. And thank you for everyone at the Radcliffe Institute for all of the great work that you're doing in coordinating these events, despite the constraints that we're currently all living under. I'm very excited to share this talk with all of you that are joining us here virtually today, this talk entitled The Fugitive Life of Black Teaching, A History of Pedagogy and Power, which is going to be a small part of the book that I just recently completed while here at Radcliffe as a fellow, but I'm excited to share it with you all today and looking forward to the questions that you might have afterwards to have a bit of discussion. So I'll begin. For the embattled reality of Black teachers and students, we have almost no language. Their history is not only a story of triumph, nor only one of defeat. The heritage of Black education requires the embrace of competing narratives, persecution, and resistance. While initially drawn to the subversive practices of Black teachers and their students, I found the language of resistance, or the challenging of power, to be accurate but insufficient. Scholars often focus on Black people's struggle to gain access to education, desegregation through courts, and exceptional narratives of educational achievement. The history of separate and unequal education is important, but while such narratives capture anti-Black persecution in the American school, they do very little to appreciate the art of Black teaching or Black educational strivings across generations. The everyday character of their resistance has largely gone unacknowledged. Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson, and the Art of Black Teaching is my attempt to offer a more balanced account. This effort has required new language to talk about the dynamic stories of Black education in the 19th century through Jim Crow. Fugitivity names more precisely the form that resistance takes in these contexts. Fugitivity is covert, concealed, hidden, planning and intentional strategy. What I call fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination, actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And so to illuminate key aspects of fugitive pedagogy, I'd like to begin with the scenario from the archive. Tessie McGee read to her students in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The state's all-white Department of Education and local school board gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, from which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum, yet on many occasions, McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably on her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. She read to us from that book, one of McGee's students recounted, quote, "When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk and teach us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. For the remainder of my time, I will look closely at three aspects of this particular scenario: the teacher, the textbook, and the student. I'll offer close readings of Ms. McGee's effort to escape the official curriculum by way of the hidden transcript literally resting on her lap, how Woodson's textbook, The Negro in Our History, rendered a competing narrative of Black life that defied racist school policies and curricula, and finally, the student, Jerry Moore, who bore witness to McGee's fugitive practice, leaving a record of it to be studied in the future. The teacher. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of fugitive pedagogy. Her concealed lesson rejected the degrading representations of Black life in official school curricula, and her refusal manifested in physical form. McGee's public display of the official outline was a masked performance of complicity, an embodied text that accompanied the subversive and spoken content of her lesson. McGee's physical act of switching texts also communicated important messages to her students, demonstrating how defiance could at times be disguised by public performances of deference to the coercive regime of school authorities. Teachers like McGee gained access to alternative scripts of knowledge through what sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks, institutions like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and Black Teacher Associations. Such organizations comprised a veiled yet networked world of Black education, one where Black Americans said one thing and did another. Given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black educational strivings were rarely on full display. African Americans responded, often in quiet, calculated acts of resistance against oppressive school settings that reflected a world order built on their subjection. fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as individual acts of practice. For example, the principal entering McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. And records suggest that Jones supported the inclusion of Black history and culture at Webster Parish. He was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work. And Woodson regularly appeared on programs at the annual meetings of Black teacher associations at the state and national level. So it is not implausible then to consider that Jones and McGee may have very likely conspired together, the principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the room. Wearing the mask, as Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. In Black segregated schools, the intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping school ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off their Negro school to visitors or for some routine inspection. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing domination. This is to say, the person walking into McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts. If they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. And just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, learned of Woodson's textbook being used in the local Black high school. The books were confiscated, teachers were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened and forced to resign. After reading the textbook, the school board, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, end quote. They assured their white constituents that they will be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. Examples of this kind of violent oversight are plentiful, and they move forwards and backward in time. Black teachers were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. Some notable examples being, of course, Ida B. Wells in Tennessee, John W. Davison in Georgia, Anna Julia Cooper in Washington, D.C., and of course, Septima Clark in South Carolina. And yet, some teachers lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. Black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them at times to conceal their pedagogical objectives in the presence of intrusive white power. Subjection to surveillance and violence motivated by no causal logic whatsoever was a fact of Blackness. African-American educators developed strategies to contest this reality, which ranged from broad institutional realms down to the interpersonal and psychic levels. Fugitivity, in its historical reference, holds in place both the realities of constraint and Black people's constant straining against said confinement. It is careful not to overstate one or the other. And as Fred Moten aptly notes, and I paraphrase, escape is an activity, it's not an achievement. The possible threat of recapture always lingered. Escape was unresolved and uncertain, and Black teachers carried intimate knowledge of such precarity. The textbook. So my concern with the historical framing of Black education began with the textbook. I came across passing references to Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, one of which is pictured on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in New Orleans during the 1930s. But I was aware that Woodson played a central role in African-American studies as the second African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1912, and as the founder of Negro History Week in 1926, which we now celebrate as Black History Month. But I was shocked to learn about the size of his impact on educational practice during Jim Crow, in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms. While most accounts emphasize his role as a historian, affectionately referring to him as the father of Black history, Much less has been written about Woodson's 30-year career as a public school teacher. The wide circulation of his ideas and curriculum materials among Black educators implied, for me, a more complicated story than those suggested by pervasive images of dilapidated school buildings and the aggressive neglect of Black education that dominate public memory and, in large part, academic scholarship on the subject. What intrigued me most about Woodson's textbooks, as well as those written by Black public school teachers before him, was their extensive commemoration of fugitive slaves and Black fugitive life. As early as 1890, Black educators wrote textbooks filled with heroic narratives about enslaved Blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, stories of Black maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. But that's not all. The fugitive slave emerged as a folk hero and cultural symbol in curricula developed by these educators. The fugitive slave also appeared in school naming practices and within commemorative ceremonies in school activities and rituals. Black Americans established a heroic tradition around these stories and names associated with this pedagogy of escape. As a folk hero in Black curricular imaginations, the fugitive slave carried important insights about the interior life of teachers and students. It was this realization that prompted my reliance on the fugitive slave archetype and on fugitive pedagogy as a theory and practice of Black educational life in the United States. The term is more than an elaborate metaphor. It names a phenomenon that surfaced within the archive at multiple levels. It indexes the embodied and intellectual acts of subversion that were central to Black educational strivings, while emphasizing how many of these acts transpired in secret. And what's more, the concept draws a narrative line from the enslaved people's defiance of anti-literacy laws, which rendered Black education and criminality equal transgressions, to actions such as Tessie McGee's subversive use of Woodson's textbook. It was clarifying for me to learn that the first textbooks were written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. A textbook on the origins and history of the colored people represents the beginning of a formalized practice of Black people striving to rewrite the epistemological order. Having observed that, quote, "We suffer from the want of a collection of facts so arranged as to present a just view of our historical origin," end quote, Pennington refused the master narrative. The fugitive slave William Wells Brown also wrote a textbook in 1863. As the 19th century witnessed the proliferation of print culture, Black Americans used these resources to nurse their liberatory dreams. Like newspapers, journals, and various other forms of Black print culture, textbooks became tools, not only of the master, but also of the fugitive slave. My use of the term fugitive also draws inspiration from literary scholars Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman's discussion of what they call fugitive justice, where they introduced the idea of, quote, two competing narratives of the fugitive's identity, end quote. Fugitive connotes the dual image of one who escapes enslavement or jailed confinement, which justifies his capture, even death, at the hands of law enforcement. Yet, as Hartman and Best explain, the violence of enslavement and legal capture engenders as well the countervailing narrative of and by the fugitive as victim of anti-Black domination. And we find parallel, equally competing historical images when adapting this conceptualization to American education. The dominant story of the nation's past had long vilified, devalued, and disrespected Black people, thereby justifying their persecution in various forms, including enslavement, disenfranchisement, and imprisonment, and of course the list goes on. But this violent reality and the hypocrisy it exposed about the nation prompted a counter-historical narrative and ways of knowing. Indeed, one represented in the extensive factual evidence contained in Carter G. Woodson's textbooks. Such counter readings of the world carried over to Woodson's theorizing about Black education. In his iconic text, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson wrote, quote, "Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded," end quote. He suggested that the political conflicts at the core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. Woodson anticipates Saidiya Hartman's assertion that the linear progress narrative of slavery to freedom breaks down when we look at the material and social political conditions of Black life after emancipation. So thinking with these scholars, I reconsider Black education in the post-Civil War era as intimately situated in what Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, or what Woodson termed himself the sequel to slavery. In his first textbook, The Negro in Our History, Woodson offered the following: "How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances." Woodson named the entanglement of violent white opposition and the enslaved people's steady practice of learning as a means of escape, offering it as a generative lesson for students and educators during Jim Crow. Indeed, this was the origin story that framed what was politically at stake in their teaching and learning. This dialectic was the heritage of Black education. At its highest calling, Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school's official protocols and curricula. So let us now consider the Louisiana textbook that informed Tessie McGee's required lesson plan. According to records from Louisiana's Department of Education, 2 textbooks were formally adopted for secondary instruction: Modern Times and the Living Past by Henry Elson and An American History by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson. Both render distorted images of Black life, but I'll offer just one brief example from the 10th grade textbook. In the first chapter of Modern Times, Elson wrote the following, quote, "Not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress." He explains that almost the entire book will be devoted to the doings of the Caucasian race, or more specifically, at least 9/10 of the book must be given to an account of the Indo-European branch of the race, as the Indo-Europeans have dominated the world for the past 2,500 years, end quote. So based on Louisiana's adopted curriculum, Tessie McGee and her students were narratively condemned, to borrow from Sylvia Wynter. It deemed them to be of no human concern. So while we are unaware of the exact passage McGee might have been reading from Woodson's textbook, we at least know what she was negating. Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District in Washington, D.C. He lived, worked, and died in this building. From this post, Woodson responded personally to letters written by individual teachers. Some wrote him with historical questions. Others inquired in hushed tones about strategically working to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country, packaged Negro history kits by hand, and shipped off decorative materials for teachers to refashion their classrooms. Interestingly enough, it's during the Depression years that Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically. After developing an unfavorable reputation among white philanthropists by 1930, Woodson would come to rely on the Black masses to support his Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and Black teachers were at the forefront of this cause. Woodson charged that the reconstitution of knowledge was a critical step in challenging violent assaults against Black humanity. He professed, quote, "There would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom," end quote. Woodson often named this schoolroom lynching duality because it highlighted what was fundamentally at stake. Education was not just about vocational trades, developing more Black professionals, or bourgeois performances of citizenship. It was about insisting on Black social and political life as opposed to death. It meant making legible the social disfiguring of Black humanity that whiteness demands for its propping up, and refusing it through counter readings of the word and world. Pending radical reformation of the American school, Woodson urged Black educators to perform bold acts of defiance. The student. Black students were always watching. To elevate the significance of Tessie McGee's fugitive pedagogy, I want to invert the scenario and draw your attention to the student as witness. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of McGee as she removed her mask of compliance when it was safe to do so, and how her eyes went back to the book in her lap. In recounting this one gesture by his teacher, Jerry Moore revealed how what was seen, heard, and felt in Black classrooms all affected what students learned. Education extended far beyond what was uttered or written. They learned from the value systems that shaped school routines and the actions of their teachers. All the while, Black students were watching them, witnessing. First-person accounts by Black students are central to my thinking on Black teachers and the politics of African-American education. Their chorus of voices expand the historical record in critical ways, providing some of the most reliable sources on what Black teachers actually did beyond the watchful eye of white paternalism and surveillance. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944. The scholar and activist recalled that Woodson's Negro History Week was the highlight of our year. During these commemorative weeks, her teachers instructed students to, quote, slam shut and cast aside the books that did their best to persuade us that our ancestors were much better off during slavery than they would have been had they remained in Africa, end quote. Davis and her schoolmates were allowed to rely on our own ability to produce knowledge about the conditions surrounding our lives. Students were invited to engage in a collective critique of the normative white curriculum and their casting it aside. More than a captive audience, Black students were active participants, dissident learners participating in a tradition of fugitive pedagogy. Davis recalled encountering a photo of Harriet Tubman. I remember, she said nostalgically, I always visualized Harriet Tubman as my grandmother. I thought my grandmother bore this striking resemblance to her, and that remains with me to this day, end quote. Tubman's picture inspired Davis not only because it shared some likeness with her grandmother, but also because of the script accompanying the image of this fugitive slave. According to Davis, her teachers emphasized how Harriet Tubman helped more slaves to gain their freedom than any other conductor on the Underground Railroad. When writing about her student experiences in Birmingham, Davis also bore witness to the vulnerability of her teachers. She described the belittling actions of white visitors and school authorities, writing, quote, when these white assaults were staged, I tried to decipher the emotions on the teacher's face, acquiescence, obsequiousness, defiance, or the pain of realizing that if she did fight back, she would surely lose her job, end quote. Undergirding these experiences was a shared vulnerability between teachers and students. And Davis gives language to this in recalling the racialized violence in Birmingham during her childhood. She recalled the sounds of bombs exploding across the street from her home, as well as her mother having been the teacher to one of the young girls killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Such events reflected the perpetual threat that Black teachers, students, and communities had to reckon with, both in and outside of the classroom. Writing about Black witnessing, poet Elizabeth Alexander argues that Black people have been looking, and quote, forging a traumatized collective historical memory, end quote, that frames ongoing experiences of conflict. She calls this a practical memory, one that crucially informs African Americans about the lived realities of how violence and its potential shapes our individual experiences as part of the larger group. Like Alexander, I insist that bearing witness in the Black tradition has meant more than mere spectatorship. To this point, we might recall Frederick Douglass writing about the terrible spectacle of his aunt's violent assault in his slave narrative. Douglass takes care to note that he was doomed to be both a witness and a participant. The witnessing in Black classrooms was textured by the shared vulnerability of teachers and students, therefore requiring shared action. Jerry Moore recognized this in Miss McGee's classroom as her lesson plans switched with the turning of a doorknob. Angela Davis recounted the intellectual partnership between students and teachers as they engaged in a shared critique of the American curriculum. Such moments hinged on a fugitive reading practice of the known world. And the transcript of students bearing witness to fugitive pedagogy goes far and wide. In 1929, a student at the National Training School for Women and Girls explained the following in her yearbook, quote, "This school teaches history and Negro history, and the students are tremendously inspired by learning the truth about their race. Dr. Carter G. Woodson's books are used as the text here, and we have a room, a real library, if you please, set apart for the study of Negro life and history." A few pages later, the training school students celebrated one of their peers, Catherine Allen, for being outspoken against racial injustice. Having been inspired by their lessons in Negro history, Allen became a race agitator, as the students called it. In fact, many race agitators have been discovered, and Miss Allen, a senior, is sure to be another Sojourner Truth. They celebrated the young activist in the making, and the fugitive slave reappears as a folk hero, Sojourner Truth having been featured as her own superlative category. Congressman John Lewis offered a similar narrative when recalling, quote, "the unbelievable teachers in Troy, Alabama." Lewis explained, "When I was a little child growing up in rural Alabama, a short walk to the cotton fields, my teachers would tell us to cut out photographs and pictures of great African Americans for Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week," end quote. These same teachers discreetly informed students about the civil rights protests and boycotts taking place in cities just miles away in places like Montgomery. For students like Angela Davis, the training school girls, and John Lewis, their teachers' fugitive pedagogy allowed them to situate themselves in a continuum of consciousness. They were taught to aspire to be part of a tradition of Black people who disrupted an anti-Black social order. Historian John Bracey recalled Negro History Week at Mott Elementary during the 1940s. Against the backdrop of Jim Crow, his teachers called upon students to embody the story of revolt by staging a reenactment of the Haitian Revolution. I always wanted to be Toussaint Louverture. He got to wear the hat and carry the sword and sit in the chair, right? You're on stage. You got to think elementary school. You're on stage and you have Toussaint with the big hat and the sword. Then you have the other people. We had to be the soldiers who marched around and changed clothes to trick the French. That meant you went off stage and you put on another shirt and then you came back. I wanted to be Toussaint. I thought he was the baddest dude in the world anyway. We were taught that he was the greatest military leader the world had ever seen. Don't worry about all those other people. George Washington, no. Toussaint Louverture. Why? Because he freed Haiti. He ended slavery. He defeated all the Europeans that attacked him. He was the baddest dude in the world. We knew that. The Black student body was itself a site of learning. Through dramatizations, pageants, and class assignments, students became bodies in descent, to borrow from performance theorist Daphne Brooks. Angela Davis's recognition of her grandmother's likeness to the image of Harriet Tubman had key implications for her own race and gendered body. Perhaps the lesson became most clear when the student body became Toussaint Louverture, when there was an embodied recognition between Tubman and the student's grandmother. Black learners became fugitive pedagogy enfleshed, at times literally enacting narratives of Black fugitive life. They're putting on different colored clothes as they marched on and off stage to trick the French. The form and function of such performance was not unrelated to Tessie McGee's covert use of Woodson's textbooks in the Jim Crow classroom. the very textbook documenting a history of Black people's learning as a means of escape. These scenarios, scattered across time and place, were not sporadic, unplanned events or mere infrapolitics. They reflect coordinated efforts on the part of Black educators. In Fugitive Pedagogy, in the classroom was just a dress rehearsal. Students' participation in the subversive politics of Black education anticipated and prefigured their active involvement in the civil rights and Black power movements on the horizon, not to mention their demands for Black studies in the American university. Resistance was omnipresent in Black segregated classrooms. Contrary to popular assumptions, Black teachers promoted that resistance in the minds of their students, and it built up over time and culminated in the modern freedom struggle. Their pedagogy was like a river, and it moved through the lives of their students. It ebbed and flowed, took unexpected turns, but always continued in the direction of a new world. So I'd like to end where I began. It's time we have new conversations about Black education. And such new conversations demand new language, or perhaps old language, repurposed and infused by new semantics. Our modern word pedagogy derives from an ancient term for a slave who was tasked with teaching. The Latin pedagogus refers to a slave of relatively high status, if you will, who escorted children to and from a site of learning. Pedagogy were responsible for the moral development of their charges. They carried the children's books, supervised them, and sometimes taught them foundational educational skills. The enslaved also embodied unwritten lessons for their young master. They taught lessons of power to charges who wielded authority over them by virtue of their differentiated social status and bloodlines, and the former status as property. The perspective of the enslaved yields a different script of knowledge, however, a witness to systems of power that rely on their subjection. In that fugitivus, Latin means flying, fugitive, or running away, especially a runaway slave, and that pedagogus names the slave who makes learning possible, pedagogus fugitivus then, the fugitive pedagogue, might be interpreted as the absconded slave who disrupts dominant protocols of knowledge production and the conditions under which it is taught. In fleeing from their assigned role in the order of things, pedagogy inspired new lessons. Their flight prefigures alternative paths of learning. Fugitive pedagogy, in its ancient and modern historical meaning, generally refers to the enslaved fleeing from the dominant protocols of teaching and learning and the narrative scripts that structure these experiences. Their violent alienation demands their suspicion and refusal. As such, the entire apparatus of schooling is called into question when the enslaved think and plot their own course of action, when their response is flight, when they steal possession of their own life. Fugitive pedagogy, thinking now of the modern post-Middle Passage context as conceptualized in this book, encapsulates the enslaved and their descendants engaging in the process of thinking the world anew. It is grounded in the assertion that those who have been marked as slave, as Black in the modern world, might initiate a new ceremony of knowledge. The Black teachers and students called upon in my book are portals into a heritage of fugitive pedagogy. I hope to have told their stories in a way that moves beyond mere description and narratives of heroic struggle, instead having teased out insights about the deeper meaning of education and Black people's struggle for human goodness and flourishing, for a new world to be and new ways to be in the world. As Toni Morrison showed through her fictional character Sixo, a language is only worth speaking or writing or singing if you can see a future in it. I look to Black teachers of the past whose fugitive acts can teach us so much about the future. They represent a tradition that has been plundered from today's Black educators who are its rightful inheritors. And yet, all who are committed to critical pedagogy might draw inspiration from their legacy. I see the cast of characters in my book as standard bearers, a tradition passed through these teachers and their students. And their heritage is one worthy of both praise and deep study. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarvis, for this absolutely wonderful presentation. As you can imagine, we have many questions, so let me go immediately to the first one. Your work is a terrific and much needed intervention in the scholarship about Black teachers, which too often is premised on a deficit framework. I wonder if you would comment on how your fugitive concept illuminates Black teachers' role once the NAACP began its campaign against unequal education. This is a later period that your currently work focuses on.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the work by Vanessa Siddle Walker is very important here. Her book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, does a really wonderful job of looking at the partnership between Black teacher associations and the NAACP. And one of the things that is done when thinking about this kind of subversive history of Black teachers is we realize is that while we often think of the NAACP and lawyers as having been the kind of lead people in actually leading towards, Brown versus the Board of Education, or teacher salary, the kind of litigation to kind of equalize pay between Black teachers and white teachers, what we find is that it's actually Black teachers in the background intentionally funneling these cases to the NAACP, or at least finding the kind of plaintiffs for the NAACP to represent, but also Black teachers secretly funneling money to support these efforts as well. So that book by Vanessa Siddle Walker, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, tells that story, which is very much so a part of this narrative of fugitive pedagogy. Because, and I'll give an example, there's a one educator that comes up in my book that's really important, particularly while we see all these examples of Carter G. Woodson's books making its way into rural parts of Alabama, is an educator named Harper Council Trenholm, who was the president of Alabama State Teachers College, and which was the college that produced a lot of the teachers in Alabama. He was a council member of Woodson's organization, and when it became illegal for teachers to be, dues-paying members of the NAACP, he says to another teacher in a correspondence, "We'll just have to take it underground," right? So essentially, because Black teachers are public employees and could be fired if it's found out that they're members of the NAACP, they are secretly supporting the efforts of, Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers working for the NAACP. So we see this kind of hidden partnership, right? So Black teachers are kind of the silent partners the entire time during the kind of efforts that we see happening through the NAACP.
Mm-hmm. Great. The second question, considering your work on fugitive pedagogy, specifically its concealed nature, how should we expand our methods of studying the history of Black education and Black teachers?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a question that I struggle with a lot in the first part of working on this project, is because in so many ways, a lot of the kind of formal archives that we have often tell the kind of above ground narrative of the work that teachers are doing. If we go to formal public school records and things like that. But for me, the reason that Black students' accounts became so important is because we start to see Black educators in a different light through the eyes of their students, because we're actually seeing the interior part of their classrooms and what they're doing, which are things that will often not be represented in the kind of formal documents that might be in traditional archival records. So for me, that often means kind of triangulating between various different sources, whether that be public school reports, but then also the kind of records of trying to find the records of Black teachers themselves, which unfortunately have not been preserved in the way that they should, which is the direction that my work is moving in, to try to preserve some of those records. But it means seeking out Black voices to try to kind of hold those against what we see in other kind of traditional forms of archives, and to kind of think between the tensions that are presented there. Because oftentimes we'll find, Black teachers showing up in the archival record in ways that actually contradict what we see them doing in real time. And even sometimes they'll publicly say things that contradict what they're actually doing, right? So we have to be able to be nimble in our thinking about sources and what's a reliable source, and how we hold various different sources against one another.
Mm-hmm. Following on this matter of sources and materials, there are a couple of questions about that. So the first one is, what libraries and archives did you consult to find this wonderful and I'm sure rare and elusive text and images? And followed by a second question that asks specifically about material on Jerry Moore's stories, and where did you find those?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I should say, so I began, when I wrote my dissertation, the book is completely different from the dissertation because of the story of Jerry Moore and his teacher. So I wrote my dissertation on Carter G. Woodson and his partnership with Black teachers. I didn't come across the story of Tessie McGee and Jerry Moore until after I had completed my dissertation. And I had met I'm a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which is an academic organization for people who study and teach and who are concerned about Black life and culture in an academic, in an academic setting. But I met a member of the organization who told me about these videos and these collections from Asala from previous years, and she invited me to look at some of these materials in a storage room at her church in Maryland. So, I'm watching some of these old video footage from past Asala events, annual kind of Founders Day celebrations for the organization, and Jerry Moore is giving this narrative. He's presenting this narrative at one of the events, and I immediately, a kind of light bulb went off in my head. It really just kind of put so much of what I have been studying into practice in this one particular scenario in classroom. And then I started to dig more into Jerry Moore and Tessie McGee's story. So in addition to that, those video archives from a member of Asala named Barbara Spencer Dunn, who was, allowed me to look at these materials at her church. I also found a oral history of Jerry Moore in the History Makers Oral Histories digital database as well from previous years, where he told the story again in that context. And then I did some digging, was able to find records about the Webster Parish School from local newspapers and things like that. And just kind of pulling all these things together to try to open up the story.
Mm-hmm. Great. The next question, how much is learning about Black lives and history as a means of escape, but also because it is not encouraged, still a part of the education of students at historically Black colleges today?
That's a great question. I think that what this kind of tradition represents is something, I'm talking about fugitive pedagogy in the context of education, but in so many ways, it really is a part of a much broader narrative of Black political life and Black cultural life as well in the US that carries over to multiple kinds of institutions. And this is why there's a book on historically Black colleges that just recently came out by Jelani Favors, who talks about the kind of learning that happened outside of the formal classroom at HBCUs historically that really kind of nurtured the kind of leadership of the civil rights movement and the Black Power era. And that's a book I want to mention here because I think it's important to think about that, even as I don't focus on HBCUs too much. But I will say that those environments and the space that HBCUs create have always kind of been a meeting ground in a kind of communal space, so to speak, where, when Black people have opportunities to gather in that way, I think the learning that becomes possible is something that continues to kind of carry over to the current moment. And so that's what I'd say about that. But that question also reminds me about what I didn't answer in the previous question about archives that I visited. Seeking out the records of Black teachers required me to kind of go to different places, whether that be the Library of Congress that had a lot of Woodson's papers, but also, for instance, the papers of schools like the Washington, D schools and the Nannie Helen Burroughs School example that I gave, but also going to places like Fisk University, Southern University in Baton Rouge, because a lot of these HBCU archives have so much of the history of these teachers because so many teachers went to HBCUs, right? So there's a wide range of kind of archives that I had to visit, including places in the North, right? Thinking about Black teachers in Chicago who are also a part of this kind of narrative. Even if the large base of them are really in the South, we still find teachers in places like Chicago and New York who are a part of these organizations, and New Jersey as well, and seeking out their papers in local archives in those places.
Mm-hmm. Great. The next question, what happened with the fugitive pedagogy, with the forced integration in which Black high schools were closed and Black students were obliged to attend the local white high schools?
Yeah, that's it's a great question. And one of the things that I would say is, when we think about desegregation, we always have to think about that in relationship as well to the kind of massive firing and demotions of Black teachers and the gutting of many of these institutions that were so central to cultivating these practices, and this very, and really, you know, it's fugitive pedagogy, but it's really just a very robust intellectual culture among Black teachers that we see in the colored teacher associations or Black teachers' involvement in things like, you know, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. When it came to the desegregation efforts, those Black teacher associations were forced to dismantle themselves and merge with white teacher associations where Black educators, you know, the same white teacher associations that were previously refusing to allow them to have membership or to kind of integrate their schools, right? So we can imagine what those mergers looked like. And so much was really lost in that, not just because of the kind of massive firing of Black teachers, but because of the kind of pedagogical model that was really embedded in the institutional frameworks that they had created for a century, right? When you think of the earliest Black Teacher Association was created in 1861, and by the 1970s, all of them are essentially dismantled and forced to merge with white teacher associations. So that's a narrative that I think that it's important to kind of understand and think more critically about as we, you know, look back in hindsight on that moment about, you know, some of the things that were kind of lost. And it's always important to say, this is not a kind of glamorization of Black segregated schooling, right? No one's advocating and saying that school segregation in Jim Crow was kind of wonderful. What I'm saying is that it's important for us to try to recuperate the practices and the important pedagogical models that Black teachers have perfected and worked to create that actually did a lot of good. And it's important to reclaim some of those traditions and to think about what they can teach us for the current moment.
Mm-hmm. And just about that, the next question is there an ongoing need for literal fugitive pedagogy in today's high school and college classrooms? Or has the need for literal fugitive teaching in American classroom changed to a different kind of subversiveness or fugitive pedagogy today?
So I will say, and this is always one of those things for me, it's the language of fugitive pedagogy as in the historical context in which I'm writing about it, I want to make sure that I always emphasize the real kind of physical threats and danger that these teachers were living under and the kind of precarity that they experienced under the context of Jim Crow. And before that, before Jim Crow, thinking about this kind of experience that extends to the context of slavery. You know, while not equating those experiences to the current moment, this is to say, you know, there still needs to kind of push back against curriculum, but I think there's probably, you know, a bit more space for educators to do that in the current moment. Certainly there are some, there are some restraints, but I'm just always kind of hesitant to kind of equate the experience of these teachers historically in the current moment. That being said, there continues to be Black educators in the current moment and educators who are working to kind of embody and practice critical pedagogy, who are willing to challenge and openly engage their students in ways that kind of critique the kind of structures that we see in place in schools today. And so I definitely think that there are remnants of this kind of tradition that we see showing up in the contemporary moment. And while the context is very different, I think that it still manifests. I can think of my own experiences and think of educators that I had who explicitly did things that challenged what we were supposed to be learning in the classroom, and they made that very explicit in terms of my own experiences. So I know that that's something that still manifests, even if not at the same scale that we see it in this historical context.
Mm-hmm. Great. A question about the students now. So you talk about students' importance in the cycle of teacher, textbooks, and students. What can students do to enhance the teacher, the textbook, and the curriculum?
Can you ask that question one more time?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about students' importance in the cycle of teacher, textbooks, and students. What can students do to enhance the teacher, the textbook, and the curriculum?
Right. One of the things that I think, I think that, students are always, bringing to the classroom their own lived experiences as well. And I think that also, at its best, learning is always working to meet students where they're at, right? So thinking about how one's own lived experience becomes an extension of the curriculum in a certain kind of way. How does one's personal experience become a kind of learning resource as you're engaging with the kind of materials that are being presented in schools and in classrooms? But one of the things that I also thought about when you were asking that question is also students becoming teachers of others as well. That's a huge part of the narrative in this in the book. And also, many of the teachers that I trace, I look at how they talk about their student experience, and then how they talk about the things that they themselves did as teachers. Because these Black teachers that were embodying this kind of tradition of fugitive pedagogy were often doing it because they themselves had experienced it in the context of these Black segregated schools as well. So I think that students can think about ways that they themselves can model this kind of critical educational practice in their own peer pedagogies, in terms of how they share information with their classmates, with other students and people in their communities, right? Or their families. I think that thinking about it in that kind of more expansive ways, I think opens it up for us to think about who has the power to be an educator and a teacher in a much more expansive way that I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jarvis, thank you for a wonderful presentation and these novel perspectives. I also want to thank you, our audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.